You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
Hi, I'm Michael Bourguignon with Life in Quebec, and welcome back to Election Perspectives, our weekly roundup of the federal election campaign. We're here again with Colin Standish. How are you, Colin?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again.
You can hear us okay?
Yeah, no, it's great.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so let's look at what's happened in the past week. Let's start with the Mike Duffy trial. We all know what's going on there. It seems to have come back to bite the backside of the Conservative Party with the revelation that Stephen Harper's current Chief of Staff, Ray Novak, was well aware of the $90,000 check cut by Nigel Wright for Duffy's expenses. What do you think this might mean for the Conservative campaign?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Certainly the Duffy affair is it's very high profile right now, and it's perplexing that Mr. Harper would have called the election during this time. Just to go back in time, I actually suspected he might delay the election because, of course, it's only legislation that he could actually have extended it for another year, technically, under a Westminster system. 5 years, but he called it now. And that's just the context. But going back to the check, yes, that is current Chief of Staff, and he's standing by him. But will Mr. Harper throw him under the bus like they did Nigel Wright, where it was sort of he resigned, he was fired? We've heard a variety of answers from the Prime Minister on this regard. So how long will he stay by Ray Novak? But it is disturbing that we don't seem to be getting the truth out of not to necessarily accuse the Prime Minister of that, but it seems that the stories, there's incongruities, so to speak, with regards to Mr. Harper's story, with regards to Nigel Wright, with regards to Ray Novak. We're seeing Nigel Wright quoting the Bible in regards to his emails that are curt, and he has a law degree and a master's in law from Harvard. So it's hard to believe what's going on here, but it seems that Canadians are going to start to notice that. Not to say this about Mr. Harper, I wouldn't want to defame his reputation, but duplicity and dishonesty do matter to people. And when we see Mr. Harper and others squirming and the stories don't make sense and don't add up, Canadians are going to see through that, I think.
Well, the accusations are out there in the media as we speak. We know that Prime Minister Harper is not going to comment because the trial is ongoing, but I think it'll be fair to keep an eye on it and see what happens as the campaign goes on. In the meantime, the leaders have been crisscrossing the country, unveiling their platform planks, one plank at a time. One of the things that came out this week was Prime Minister Harper's talk of a minimum mandatory sentence for certain crimes, increasing the life sentence for serious crimes like killing a police officer and what do you call it, high treason, whatever that means. Judges have spoken out against this kind of thing, but clearly it's in line with the Conservatives' get tough on crime approach. So what do you make of this, and how do you think Canadians and Quebecois will react to this?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, that's been highly critical. I mean, as a young jurist, certainly in the legal community and judges themselves, you'll read judgments. The judge will say, I don't want to impose a sentence or similar language, right? That taking away the power of sentencing from the judicial system to a certain extent through legislation is highly controversial. And to be honest, I mean, I'm not even though I've studied criminal law, I'm not an expert in criminal law by any means, but it's going to be very interesting to see. And I think this is really to appeal to Mr. Harper's base as sort of tough on crime. And it's been highly criticized by jurists, by commentators, that having, of course, having, harsh penalties in theory for people who commit heinous crimes like high treason, for example, or I can't remember the way they framed it. Perhaps you can remind me at the end, but they sort of inventing these new crimes and then imposing mandatory sentencing. It's that really that should be left to the to the legal system itself. But it doesn't really make a sense that we should be moving towards, in my opinion, restorative justice. So putting people back into the community, locking people up for arbitrary reasons, it doesn't make sense and it's not good public policy, and it's expensive. We've seen in the States where we have millions of people behind bars, and it only creates recidivism, that people are going to commit crimes again. So it really doesn't make any public policy sense. This is really to appeal to Mr. Harper's base, I think. It doesn't make logical sense to me.
Okay, so it does appeal to the base, but do you think there's any appeal across Canada, across Quebec in general?
Yeah, I don't think Quebecers want this necessarily. I think it's going to appeal to certain slices of the electoral base. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but really, there's a great article that came out by Bob Ray on Friday where he's interviewed by Rudyard Kipling,
right,
who runs the month debates, and it's an excellent article. I recommend everyone read it. But it's about slicing and dicing the electorate. So this is to appeal to certain people, I'd say, generally in Western Canada, often in rural areas. This is to appeal to the base, that this is a sort of tough on crime thing that's going to appeal to certain slices of the electorate, whether they'll only be 5 or 10%, but that's going to sway some people in certain key areas for the Conservatives. I think that's the logic behind it. But I don't think it's going to appeal to Quebecers necessarily. There's much. I think that there's a different that sort of this hard, tough on crime that has been, that you've seen justice ministers, sue the government about sort of the gun control. Right? You actually saw the Quebec, provincial government sue the federal government. This is unprecedented or nearly unprecedented. So I think you'll see a bit of blowback actually.
Okay. When you talk about the Conservative base. One member of that base made headlines this week by shouting and swearing at reporters. I think we should give this guy all the attention he deserves, if you know what I mean. Let's just let that die. But it's interesting that campaigns are always waged in the media. That's just a fact. How do you see social media playing out and having any impact on the outcome of this election? Because the video of this gentleman went viral, and in this day and age, we tweet and everything else, and so it's not a new medium by any stretch, but it's fairly new in terms of elections. I mean, it's every 4 years, and it certainly should have some sort of impact. How do you see it playing out?
Yeah, no, excellent commentary there. No, certainly that video did go viral, but I think there's two issues here: sort of the interpretive role of the media. The media is critically important, as like in Quebec, has generated numerous ideas and influenced public policy. And it's a very important interpretive framework. There's so much policy, press releases coming out. We need an unbiased media, or at least a media that states it's biased, to interpret it for Canadians. Most of the time, there's always too much information from 5 parties that are in the game, and other ones as well. There's independent candidates. We need the media there. So and then we saw that video come out, and then to deal with directly what we saw. That we saw sort of a very, sort of upset member of a Conservative supporter, allegedly. I don't know all the details. I guess people have been going into who this man exactly was. But you saw a lot of anger interpreted towards the media. They felt there's a bias, and he was questioning tax records, and it was very strange sort of, altercation. But this opinion that, it seems to be in some Conservative circles have spoken about in the media this week, or by commentators, is that really there has been a war on the media, that it's really, you see with Mr. Harper's press releases, you see with the announcements, it's just permanent campaigning. This was touched upon in Bob Ray's article. We're on the permanent campaign, and I think you've seen that coming to Ontario with the Ontario provincial government has been very adept at, with Kathleen Wynne's announcements. You see they almost feel Harper-esque, not to compare her to Mr. Harper, but you see that kind of permanent campaign messaging. But to bring it back, sorry, just not to get off on a tangent, but to bring it back to exactly what he says, I think that that opinion is the opinion of some people, that we saw it particularly harshly articulated in that video. But it's resonated so strongly because there is this war of, I'd say misinformation at times of the media. There's the constant messaging, so it's touching upon the way many Canadians feel about the information coming out of this government, that it's just been biased, that it's been, too controlled over the last decade. And then as well, it touches on the Conservative base, that there's people who actually feel the same as that gentleman. So I think that's why it's touched on our consciousness so much.
You mentioned it's a 5-party race, and that's true if you don't count the Rhinoceros Party, for instance. But the big 3 are very present, and if we switch off our smartphones and laptops long enough to pay attention, they are still using the age-old traditional medium of posters. So campaign posters are popping up all over the place. The Liberal Party posters have gotten a certain amount of attention, notably for their sort of unique look, but also for the absence of Justin Trudeau on these posters. Now, people have commented about this. Do you think that this is part of the Liberal strategy?
Yeah, that's it. Getting back to old school politicking, it's signs, it's knocking on doors, it's buttons, it's shaking hands and kissing babies to a certain extent, and that hasn't changed. And that is critically important. Certainly in many rural Quebec areas, old school politics matters, about that personal connection with the voter. And just to bring it back personally, I went door to door across a rural riding for my nomination, which I eventually did lose, of 4,500 square kilometers. I went door to door to door. You have to make that personal connection. But then to bring it back to the advertising, there has been commentary about the pictures. These new Liberal ones that came out just as the election was called. They're almost look like avatars to a certain extent. I actually like them. They look very, suave and sophisticated. But there has been some criticism of that. I don't think they're necessarily playing down Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau has been very popular, though you see a lot of criticism. Is he ready for power? There's those conservative attack ads. But I don't think they're downplaying Justin Trudeau. Trudeau, I think with the open nomination process, like I experienced, that you really, the eventual winners in those races are very connected to their communities. So to emphasize the personal brand of an individual is important, and certainly the Liberal Party brand. So I've always had a bit of skepticism. I'm also a bit uncomfortable sometimes with Liberal signs in the past that say, Team Martin, Team, Ignati, really emphasize this. No, let's talk about our local member of Parliament or aspiring member of Parliament. That's who we elect. We don't elect the Prime Minister directly. We are electing. If you look at our Constitution, we are electing representatives to represent their constituency. So
right.
I think it's a good old school tactic, and I don't think they're undermining or de-emphasizing Mr. Trudeau in any way.
Okay. Another age-old tactic, of course, is, as I mentioned before, unveiling the platform one plank at a time. One of the promises that came out from the NDP was about $15 a day daycare, which already exists in Quebec, and it was received with a bit of criticism because of that, because of the fact that such a thing does exist. And it's a provincial jurisdiction, and that's one of the criticisms that we've heard, that what is the constitutionality of that kind of promise? Is it even feasible? What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, just to bring it back, last week I was saying I want to see some policy out of the leaders and out of the parties, and I'm really glad we saw that this week, because, it feels like we're getting a bit more into the nitty-gritty, that it felt very sort of up in the air, and just, it was sort of, people were waffling and not really presenting new ideas to Canadians. So that was great to see that. And there's sort of a Liberal versus NDP debate about who has the best daycare plan. That you have Mr. Trudeau's plan that would, it's about making sure that that families within certain tax brackets have a variety of credits and funding to ensure they can purchase childcare. And then as well, you have now the NDP plan for $15 a day daycare. I think it's really going to connect with voters, to be honest. I think both, not to weigh in, though I am, obviously my bias is that I'm a proud Liberal, but not to weigh in necessarily on the good or bad of each, or to say one is better than the other. But I think those are both going to resonate with Canadians. That I think in Toronto, it's costing up to $1,600 a month. Like, these are the cost of rent, or in some cases mortgages, for people. To send their kids to an adequately administered daycare so their parents can work. I think this is a real policy issue that's been ignored for too long. So I'm really happy to see it in the public sector, public debate, and I hope it really resonates with Canadians, because we need a solution to this. And 65% of parents with kids, women with kids under the age of 6 are in the workforce, and we want to only improve upon that, right? So I think the NDP has said that when childcare came in Quebec, 70,000 new mothers were put into the workforce. The NDP has also said, you get $2 for every dollar invested in it, and I believe these statistics to be true. I think we need to support families in that way. But just to bring it back now to the constitutionality, that's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked that, because I did some, and I with my law degree, I do sort of know about these jurisdictional issues. So generally, that healthcare and childcare falls under the administration of the provinces, but that's not necessarily so. There is some debate that health, it was determined in 1982. Health is not defined anywhere in the Constitution. It's generally fallen under the provinces, that they have control over local affairs, and then to a certain extent internal commerce and trade. So those are under section 91 or 92. I should know that by heart. But so it comes under provincial jurisdiction. But the Supreme Court actually said in 1982, healthcare, it actually required both federal and provincial jurisdictions to work together for the best public policy solutions. Generally, it's been the provinces take the lead. So I am of the opinion that the constitutionality of the federal government to provide not just support and funding to the provinces, but actually to legislate and to go in and to create a framework that would be national. That is constitutional in my point of view. And then we have the Western Banks Supreme Court reference from 2007, which really says, you can go and legislate in other jurisdictions, in their powers. For example, in that case, it was about insurance and banking. Banking is federal in Canada, and there was provincial insurance laws that were applying. So it really was, as long as you're not totally hindering the core power of a jurisdiction, you can go in and legislate if it's not incompatible with that jurisdiction. That's essentially the nub of that. It's obviously a very sophisticated case, but that's sort of so actually the Supreme Court has said it's not a provincial or federal jurisdiction, and then the Supreme Court has also said, jurisdictions are much more fluid, or can be fluid. So I am of the opinion it is constitutional.
Okay. Definitely a very good perspective, by the way. Thank you for that. Definitely a hot button issue, especially here in Quebec. But just to briefly talk about other issues, what other policy issues do you see emerging from the campaign at this point?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I think we're going to see some, the few things I'm going to look for in the next week is going to be polling again. That I think one of the big stories is that no one's really pulled away from the pack. That you see the Conservatives maybe falling a little bit under the NDP. That the NDP's doing quite well in Quebec. I believe it's 47% in Quebec, 34% in the national polls. Of course, these fluctuate daily basis, and there's always margins of error. But the NDP is sort of in first place. Second place would be the Conservatives, 31, 32%. You have the Liberals rounding off with about 28%, 27%. These things change. But we're seeing the Liberals sort of become the opposition to the NDP in Quebec. And you see them up at 30% in the polls, if I recall correctly. But then looking at regional breakdowns, like I said, for the NDP in Quebec, you're going to see that regional dynamic. So you see Conservatives at 45% in some of the ridings around Quebec City and down to the Beauce Eastern Townships. But then you obviously see the Liberals at 50 or more percent in parts of the West Island, like Mount Royal. So you have to look at the breakdown, but I think really the vote breakdown in individual regions and ridings is going to be critically important to look at. So that's what I'm going to look at for. So looking at the numbers, and no one's really pulled away from the pack, and then looking at the regional breakdown, I think, and looking at seats. So you can say the NDP's at 34% nationally. Well, it's mostly concentrated in Quebec, and then as well, how is it having so we've seen change 20% in the polls in a rural riding where, let's say, there's 60% Conservative. Well, those votes, not to say people should vote their heart, but those votes necessarily aren't relevant, right? Where there's a concentration of votes, that's where they really matter. So, but it is fascinating that the NDP is doing so well. So really, to look at the poll numbers, look at the regional breakdown, look at the riding breakdown. I'd refer all our viewers and listeners to really look at 308.com. That's where I consult, and listen to Eric Grenier and listen to Nick Nanos. Listen to what they say about the polling. So that's something to really look at. That's what I'm going to be looking at in the next week. Well, who's going to pull away from the pack, and as well, and I also like to refer readers back, the viewers this evening back to the first debate. It really, I rewatched numerous clips of it, and it really was a sophisticated debate, the best I've ever seen. So I really want people to take a look back at that. But I think we're seeing a very sophisticated election on the issues, and really to inform themselves about healthcare, about the Sherbrooke Declaration, about policies on Quebec, about defense. I think there's a variety of issues here that Canadians should be informed of.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Colin, and thank you for watching this podcast of Election Perspectives with Life in Quebec. Tune in again next week.
Thank you for listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, editorials, and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com.